Welcome back to Lambda Bible Studies, and welcome to my returning guest extraordinaire, Praise of Folly. How are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me on, Luke.
I'm good. I've got that Friday feeling. It's Friday night, and as we all know, Friday night is Lambda night.
All right.
Which since I started saying that, I've had about 2 streams on Friday over several months. But just have to say it enough times, and people will believe it. And today, well, before we get started, let me remind people to book onto the Lambda weekend retreat, which I've now announced is on the 2nd to the 4th of August, and the form is in the description. The other thing that's in the description is all of the links to your stuff. Praise of Folly, what else do you want to point people to? What if they enjoyed today and they want to get more, where should they go?
Well, I mean, the main place to go would be my YouTube channel, but also you can find content on my Substack. I've been a little slack lately, but I do plan on getting back to it hopefully this month.
Great. So today you are making the case for non-resistance from a Christian perspective. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you want to just define your terms before you go into your arguments?
Yeah.
What do you mean by non-resistance?
Broadly, when it comes to, and this would include, so just the use of force broadly, not just the state, but also things like self-defense, right? Or interpersonal violence on behalf of someone else. You've got go ahead.
I was going to say, what about a parent physically restraining their children?
I wouldn't say that's violence. That's it's use of force, right? But it's not violence in the sense where you are intending to injure or kill someone.
Got it. Okay.
That's the difference. Mm-hmm. There's basically 4 different categories we have. We have what I'll be advocating tonight, the non-resistant category, where under no conditions is it lawful for a Christian to do such a thing. And then we have the just war tradition, which says that under certain circumstances, it's justifiable for a Christian to do such a thing, generally not in his own self-defense, but either A, as a part of a soldier in the government's army, or B, on the behalf of someone else who's under attack. Then you have what you might call the Holy War tradition, the Crusades, which is less common now, but of course for many years was a position within the Catholic Church. And then the 4th one would be realism, where you have a sort of like pragmatism to global events. There was the idea of the 4 views of culture. There was a specific author, Christianity and Culture, Reinhold Niebuhr, Christianity and Culture. He comes up with a more realist perspective where it's like the outcomes matter more than the means. So just where advocate might say that the realist is Machiavellian in the sense that, that's a morally objectionable method. But, that's just being realistic, right? So those are the 4 broad positions. And
what about yourself, your own history of thinking about this topic? When did you start thinking about it, and have you changed your views, or did you more or less begin with the pacifist position?
No, I didn't. So I started broadly with a just war tradition. I think a lot of American Christians, unless you grow up in certain faith traditions like the Amish, like the Mennonites, or other groups, you're going to end up with a just war tradition broadly.
That's the development.
Catholics don't hold the crusade tradition that much anymore. And the idea of pragmatism with Reinhold Niebuhr is just sort of seen as morally objectionable because it allows for behavior that would otherwise be considered immoral, even on a just war tradition.
Okay, great. And so what happened? Why did you reconsider initially your default position, the just war position?
Oh, there's a few reasons. One reason was during the War on Terror, right, as I got to the age where you have to basically declare your position for the draft. Are you a conscientious objector or not? There are many within the just war tradition who would say, well, this particular war isn't just, but wouldn't object to war in general. That's an argument that the government isn't going to usually accept. It's either all or nothing. If you just say no categorically, they're willing to make allowance for that. So the question is, well, okay, I didn't think the War on Terror was a just war. So how are we going to answer that? And then
question. Is it acceptable? I mean, I know this is not the question we're talking about in this stream, but if you objected from a just war perspective to a particular conscription, is it acceptable to say to the government that you have this different, lifelong, total objection to war? You pretend to be a pacifist in order to not participate in the evil.
Well, that's now we're going back to the pragmatist territory where you basically, do things that are otherwise morally objectionable in order to get a presumably desirable outcome.
Yes, indeed. Now, what do you think about that?
No, I wouldn't.
Is pragmatism acceptable from a Christian perspective?
No, not that.
Okay, sidebar over. Back to the main discussion. So you were thinking about whether or not you would be prepared to be conscripted. Quite a good moment to have this discussion, because currently, I don't know if you're aware, in Britain there has been lots of talk of conscription. I think the Prime Minister last week announced that they weren't going to be conscripting people. But the fact that he had to make that announcement means that it is something that's been rumbling around. There's been adverts for people from trying to recruit people to the army. So it's a thought that people, at least in the UK, probably have in their mind at the moment.
And so part of the thing is, well, embedded in a broader question is, what does Christianity mean? Because in the aughts, especially with the rise of postmodernism and the emergent church and everything else, a lot of things people were taking for granted were up in the air, undecided. And I'm like, okay, so then not only what does Christianity mean in this context, but what does it mean in a whole host of contexts? Because this was a period of very rapid social change where churches were jettisoning a lot of traditional doctrines and practices for relatively trivial matters. And so embedded within this broader context, the question is, how do you determine what actually is the Christian position on any of these things? Because they're all giving contradictory answers and they're all seemingly in flux. Well, I mean, one is you read the scriptures, but, as Peter said, reading Paul can be hard. So then the question is, what else? Well, as a historian, my view is go back to the source, go back to the beginning. And furthermore, that was the universal principle rally cry of the Reformation at Fontes, back to the sources. And so, well, how far back do you want to go, right? Because there's that famous Catholic quote, "To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant." But okay, well, how far back are you going to go? Now, I went back to the very beginning because I had prior to college, I had an Eastern Orthodox friend who would constantly say, "Oh, the church has always done this." I'm like, I don't find that very hard to believe. And I'm like, well, who could I read? And so this was even before this particular crisis had come up. But I was already sort of inclined to read the early church fathers because I wanted to see if this Orthodox friend of mine was, telling me the truth. Like, did they really always believe this? And I sort of, go ahead.
Is that phrase, to go back in history far enough is to cease to be Protestant, is that meant as a methodological comment or more of a historical one? Is the idea?
I think it could be both. That was
Protestantism emerged out of the Reformation, or that because I suppose there are some Protestant historians who would claim that the practices of the very earliest church were not Catholic in nature. But
right, and so using that rubric, I'm like, okay, well, this is just one other important question of what it means to be a Christian within this period of flux. And as a historian, I'm just more methodologically prone to want to do this. Like, to define anything, you need to go back to where it started in history, and then look at what it said, and what the proponents of this position said, and has it drifted or evolved over time. And what finally convinced me was that originally, and this is a case that will be made hopefully tonight, is that prior to Emperor Constantine, all the written accounts that we have of Christians and of pagans referring to Christians was that they refused military service on moral principle grounds. And then the explanation is, okay, well, then what explains this rapid and sudden change in the 4th century? Which the people who oversaw that transition, they gave their own explanation. Their explanation was eschatological. They believed that they were post-millennials and they believed the millennium had come. So So, but for
Which
me,
is maybe a more understandable position, given that the major occupying force that had been terrorizing Christians in the first couple of centuries had ostensibly become Christian at that point. So if you are postmodernist and looking at world events, it's more reasonable in the 4th century to say the end is coming, Jesus will return, we've entered the millennium, you know.
well, yeah, post millennial, yes, but also the idea is that
Yeah.
going from our vantage point, we know that has not happened, and that the Roman Empire is now gone, both east and west, and this was just a wrong reading of events. And so then looking back, it's like, okay, well, then why was this the original position? Now, also, of course, downstream of the work of, say, John Howard Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas, the classic Anabaptist Mennonite Amish position was gaining traction both in the academy and in broader Christian circles. And so that as well, those were more where you get the scriptural type arguments rather than, there is some historical, but it's primarily like a reading of scripture. But then the historical arguments come in from actually looking at how Christianity changed over that 300-year period. And so ultimately I found, to tie this all up in a bow, that question I had to answer, do you file for CO status or not? Which then really was the impetus for this decision, was then, okay, the scriptural arguments I believed were compelling that were made by these proponents, and then the historical realities that all Christians were like this up until Constantine, and then it just changes. And the fact that that's...
Is it fair to say that all 4 positions could have objected to pre-Constantine wars on their own grounds? Like it could just be that by coincidence that they objected to the Roman wars that were being waged at that time.
Well, you see, whether any of the 4 positions would have objected or not is different from the arguments given by the Christians.
The given arguments. Yes.
Right. And this is the point, right? There are the given arguments in the text. So, which is what I find to be so frustrating, is the proponents of the just war tradition will say that, well, there was no clear defined position back then. Now, we have the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers volumes, which is translated in English by Philip Schaff and Donaldson. It's 7 volumes. We know what these men wrote and said. To pretend that we don't is just blatantly dishonest. Like, it's kind of amazing we have so much written material from a persecuted minority in the Roman Empire.
So the given reason, the way that the Christians in those early centuries wrote and thought was that they should be pacifists.
Yes.
And your view as well, I think I'm right, is that you would arrive at the same conclusion from the Bible. So should we crack open the Bible and see those verses that you would go to try to make a biblical case against violence?
So why don't we start with Isaiah chapter 2?
Sure. Let me... Oh, I've stopped sharing my screen. Let me do that. Okay, here we go. Isaiah 2.
And just the first 4 verses.
I tell you what, I'll read these ones. This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be established above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many people will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore."
Okay, now Micah 4 is a sort of recapitulation of Isaiah 2. So if you don't want to read that again, that's fine. Zechariah 9 is a somewhat different argument.
Okay, so here's just for people who are watching, they can scan through and see what's in Micah 2. The thing of Micah 4, yes. The thing of God mediating between the peoples reminds me a bit of how Moses was set as the judge between the peoples, like as individuals. It's like God is to the peoples as Moses was to the people, right?
Right. And then the Zechariah 9
what's the next one? Zechariah 9
is the other Old Testament passage, verses 9 to 11.
Do you want to read these?
Yeah, I'll read those. Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. He will rule. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Okay, so let's start with Zechariah. So in Zechariah verse 9 is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which we know was fulfilled in Matthew 21 verse 5 and John 12 verse 15.
Yeah, lowly and riding on a donkey.
And then Zechariah 9:11 is the Last Supper, which is fulfilled in Matthew 26:28, Mark 14:24, and Luke 22:20. Now, we have three verses here. Verse 9 and verse 11 we know to have already been fulfilled in the passages of Scripture. Now, I would argue verse 10 is fulfilled on the Sermon on the Mount. And we'll get to that when we get to the New Testament. So Zechariah, if we look at that passage, maps well onto what we already see in Christ's life. Now, the idea of the mission of peace in Isaiah 2 and Micah 4 is that he goes to the mountain of the Lord. So that's of course implying the Sermon on the Mount. Now, this is the most important evidence in favor of this sort of prophetic interpretation. Because the reason why I start here is people are going to be like, well, what about the Old Testament? What about when God commanded Israel to destroy all these nations? What is the Old Testament pointing to? Now, if you look at all of the references to that couplet, beating their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, which is taken from Isaiah and Micah, and you look at all of the references in the ancient Nicene Church Fathers, every single one of them says that this is fulfilled with Christ's teaching in Jerusalem, that the church itself represents this reality. And that interpretation is unchanged until Eusebius, which takes a radically different view in order to justify this post-millennial interpretation of Constantine. So basically, we have this unified interpretation of a prophetic witness in the Old Testament to this future reality. And the reasons why Eusebius would change it are self-evident, given his condition.
Is this prophetic interpretation one of the things that is agreed upon by the commenters in the first couple of centuries after Christ?
Yes, there's. I've searched. I have Logos Bible software, so I've searched through all the references in the ancient Nicene volumes, and there's nobody that takes a dissenting position who references those verses. Right? Some of these works are incomplete, fragmentary, so we don't have everything they would have ever written. But again, what would be the odds that they're everybody who does comment on it comments on it in exactly this way?
Now, the way I would read these verses looks like prophecy as opposed to instruction, right? It's descriptive and not normative. It's saying peace will be gifted to the world. Everybody's, doing the right thing, beating their plowshares out of their swords, etc. And I think you'd agree that that's not the way the world has looked for the last 2,000 years. There has, in fact, been quite a lot of war. So how do you make the translation from the prophecy being a description of what it looks like it's saying what will happen, but you're reading it as a command for how God's people only should behave, I guess.
Right. So first of all, as Christians, we all live in this now and not yet tension that the church itself is the first fruits of what is to come. And so what is the purpose of the church prophetically, eschatologically in this context? It's to show the world that empowered by the Spirit of God, we are able to show them a sort of, for lack of a better word, a trailer or a preview of what is to come. Now, it's not out in the world, but the point is, because it isn't out in the world, and then as a Christian, you tell somebody to have this hope, well, they're just going to say, why should I have this hope? There's nothing that I can see or experience that would indicate to me that this is even a reasonable hope to have. And so the argument is, well, if it exists anywhere, it would exist in the church, because the church is itself the first fruits of the kingdom. And of course, again, this is a sort of both scriptural and historical argument. These prophetic passages have all been read that way up until Eusebius. And they referred to the church itself.
We see the war horses being taken from Jerusalem, and I suppose Jerusalem is, it's the capital city of the nation of God's people, right? So taking away the war horses from God's people, that sort of works. What about the chariots from Ephraim? I guess that's another, is that right? Another tribe?
Well, okay, so Ephraim is one of the sons of Joseph and was a tribe of Israel, but it's also a euphemism for the 10 tribes as a whole. So, and of course, James was written to the lost tribes, the 10 tribes.
Yeah, but it is notable in this passage that it's the people of Israel who are having their, so Jesus is kind of, as it were, arriving on the foal of a donkey and removing the chariots and war horses from not the Romans, but from the Jews.
Yeah. But of course, this is only one of 3 other, I think, important verses, Isaiah and Micah, which deal with the beating of the swords and of the plowshares, which is where we get a lot of the direct commentary by the early Christians on this matter. And the argument is eschatological. It's that we have achieved this new dispensation, though they wouldn't have used necessarily that word, dispensation. And today it's loaded because we think of dispensationalism, that we live in this different way now. And it's repeated over and over and over again. And then it abruptly changes all of a sudden with Constantine and the commentary of Eusebius. And then it never really reverts back. It's just lost. It was a universal opinion until it wasn't.
It does seem like every one of these passages talks about the nations plural. So there's kind of a refrain of it's all peoples laying down their arms. So I suppose under your interpretation, that would be the fact that the Gentiles have now been welcomed in.
Yes.
The people who were reading these prophecies may not have thought in those terms, but we now can maybe look back and understand that that's what it was talking about.
It might be helpful to at least quote one of the church fathers at length to highlight how they interpreted it. Not that I'll go through all of them, because that would be too long and wouldn't be able to cover all the material. But Justin the Martyr, who, I think he's a saint. He's considered a saint in both Orthodox and Catholic circles, and is generally considered one of the great early Christian writers. And his first apology, chapter 39, says, "And when the spirit of prophecy speaks as predicting things that are to come to pass, he speaks in this way. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And ye shall judge among the nations and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And that it did so come to pass, we can convince you. For from Jerusalem there went out into the world men, 12 in number, and these illiterate of no ability in speaking. But by the power of God they proclaimed to every race of men that they were sent by Christ to teach all the world of God. And we who formerly used to murder one another do not only now refrain from making war upon our enemies, but also that we may not lie nor deceive our examiners, willingly die confessing Christ. And that's broadly an interpretation you're going to see again repeated throughout these centuries.
Of course, you do see wars between Christian nations. I mean, you could kind of argue that the First and Second World War, were like primarily conflict between post-Christian societies, people calling themselves Christians in some cases. Although I think we could agree, not people who were in fact Christians in most cases.
Well, and again, the argument here is narrowly this, right? That not only can you draw from the Old Testament this idea of the Messiah being associated with peacefulness, but also the fact that the earliest Christians had a very clear idea of what that meant. Well, then that begs the question, well, how did that vision change? Why did it change? That's a separate argument altogether. But nonetheless, what is demonstrated here is that this was the original reading. And in part, this argument I developed by reading them. I'm like, oh, they keep referring back to these same passages over and over and over again. Not Zechariah, though. That's I think, supplementary on my part. But it does fit in with the broader narrative structure. And so
if the earliest historical records that we had for Christian opinion was from the 4th century or the 5th century, then we might extrapolate backwards and say that the earliest Christians had a pro-war perspective. So what if there was a brief moment in Christian history that was the earliest record that we have where people were thinking in this pacifistic way, but they were wrong? I mean, this is probably a broader question. This is a very Protestant question for me to have, of course. But what if the scriptures are inerrant, but then the early church fathers were wrong in all kinds of crazy directions?
Well, I mean, if we're gonna look at the errors that accumulate over time, as Christ says, you'll know the tree by its fruit. It's pretty clear that the consensus of Christendom from the 5th century on is the one that's multiplying errors.
By their fruits, the way that they were behaving.
Right, and the doctrines that they develop, right? And so you get this accumulated tradition that finally, in Western Europe, the Protestant reformers, they disagree on which parts to keep and which parts to get rid of. The Radical Reformation says get rid of all of it. The Anglicans say keep most of it. And then there's everything in the middle.
Yeah. Okay, great. Shall we go to some New Testament stuff?
Yeah. So Matthew 5:38 to 42.
Shall I read this one?
Yeah, sure. 38 to 42.
You have heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you.
Right. So,
I mean, in terms of proof texts for a stream called The Case for Christian Non-Resistance, Matthew 5:39, do not resist. That's pretty good.
Yeah, well, now there's a lot that can be said about all of Matthew 5, but I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've talked about it elsewhere and other people have talked about it elsewhere. The main thing I'll say is there are 5 5 compare and contrast that Jesus has. The first 2, all Christians accept as more or less straightforward, that lust is akin to fornication and that hatred is akin to murder, and that you shouldn't be doing because ultimately it's the slippery slope, right? You start there, and then it ends up with this maximal version of it. So you just don't even get started.
And there's very few people who will make the argument, a sort of just lust argument.
Right.
Like, there's occasions where a bit of lust for the kingdom of God, that's perfectly acceptable. And that would be the equivalent to saying that resistance is okay in the right circumstances.
Right. And so, but the three that follow, there's all this sort of, argumentation and casuistry to sort of get out of it. And I'm like, well, hold on. The structure of, like, proposition and then contrast. Proposition, contrast. It's the same throughout. So there's no reason to assume that the last three are different than the first two as a structural matter of delivery. But then,
I feel like there's probably more people who would make the instructions against divorce universal than the instructions against resistance.
Yes, there are.
I mean, I agree with you. I think this one's, everyone sort of agrees. I mean, it's quite hard, as I was implying, it's quite hard to make a hypothetical argument where looking at a woman lustfully might have a sort of positive upside. It's got this hypothetical advantage that means that even though it's sinful, it's worth doing. Divorce, I think you will find split opinions in the church, that people will come up with reasons that divorce might be the best option. But I think you'd still probably find amongst devout Christians, I think most people are still going to say this holds universally, that divorce is something that a Christian should not do except in cases of sexual immorality.
Yeah.
Oaths, I mean, I think people probably have taken this to heart largely, that people, it's no longer really a cultural practice amongst Christians to make these kind of proclamations and oaths in I don't know, what do you think about oaths?
Well, I would agree that it's less common. I mean, there's still like oaths to join the military. So if you're a Christian that believes in that, you'd still have to do that. And also, like, if you go to court,
oh yeah,
the whole truth.
I have thought about that. If I was called into court, and I think in the UK at least, you get the option of either swearing an oath or just saying yes. Well,
yeah.
So I think I'm not actually going to be put in that position, but yeah, I might take it seriously. If I was in a country where they were insisting on you making an oath, I might be like, well, it does seem to literally be against the words of Jesus. So then, given that I'm taking these three personally pretty seriously, my opinion is don't lust, don't divorce, don't swear. So then when I come to this, why am I suddenly then quibbling and thinking actually resistance is correct in this situation, that situation?
Mm-hmm. Now, I think the other thing I'll hit on for Matthew 5 is the evil one here is the word chronopos, which can either mean Satan, evil in general, or an evil person. So it can't mean do not resist Satan, because Christ does that in Matthew 4:1-11 and Luke 4:1-13, and we are, of course, enjoined to do so ourselves. Well, nor evil in general, since we're supposed to resist evil in general. 1 Corinthians 10:13, Galatians 5:16, 1 Corinthians 6:18-20, Hebrews 2:18, and on and on. So that only leaves one left, the evil person, because we know that there are explicit commandments in the other places to resist Satan and to resist evil in general. And so that's the only other thing I'll add for Matthew 5.
So if you're holding this passage up as literal, straightforward instruction, do you also defend a literal following of these other things? If somebody is going to sue you, you should offer them, instead of opposing them in court. I think the subtext here is that they're suing you unjustly. Is that fair to say? Like that
Mhm.
it's not that they actually do deserve your shirt, that you haven't stolen the shirt from them. They're suing you unjustly, and even if you would have won in court, is Jesus saying here you should not resist in court? Would you defend that as well?
Yeah, because elsewhere Jesus says, if you have a dispute with someone, settle out of court. He says, meet
That's
them.
Paul says that, right?
Well, I think Jesus says that too.
Okay, yeah.
So Jesus and Paul are in favor of private arbitration. That's what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty good power duo to support your argument there. Likewise, if you're being forced to go for a mile, I don't know what the situation would be. I don't think this is intended to be like a legal document. This is sort of teaching, right? But or if someone asks you for something, or can I borrow XYZ? Say somebody is in your church and you've got a really nice car. Well, car, they'd need a driving, whatever, lawnmower, right? You don't have a lawnmower, somebody else does. Are you morally obligated to lend it to them, even if you think that they might mess it up?
Well, I think let me go a little bit meta here. Let me back this up a little bit.
Okay.
I think one of the things in our communities we talk about a lot is a high trust society versus a low trust society. And the reason why the West in general is breaking down is because it's a low trust society. I think a lot of the objections that Christians raise to any of these teachings in Matthew 5 and elsewhere are the result implicitly of a low trust society. This is not something which is of course condemning of the church itself, because if anybody should be high trust, it should be the church. I just think it's interesting that Christians are so worried about being taken advantage of by other Christians.
I've had discussions about this where the comment has been made that it is very easy to join a church. There's almost no barrier to entry. And that makes it impossible to then hold up these kind of close communal behaviors. Right? If you have a society in which it is easy to get rid of people, you have to live up to your side of the bargain to be part of the church, then these behaviors become much more natural.
Yes, and there's also no way to get rid of them, right? I mean, how often are people actually excommunicated these days? I mean, hardly ever. So
yeah,
it's a broader. These kinds of objections, I think, stem from a broader failure of the church.
Yeah, but in this case, so that's kind of another digression that we've gone on based on those verses at the end, and I was kind of interrogating that just to check the consistency of interpretation, because if you're gonna use the first verses in a literal way as instruction, then you have to likewise consider the rest. But to go back to this, this isn't an instruction about do not resist a person from your church. It's explicitly do not resist an evil person. And like if you're not going to resist an evil person, you're certainly not going to resist a good person, right?
Yes.
So if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, now people will say this. If you follow this, you're a doormat. What do you say to that? Christians are being told here to just lie down and be walked all over, and maybe doubly so, people will say this is a feminine attitude, and it's this kind of thing that drives men out of the church.
Yeah, well, let's go to the thing about the cloak. I mean, all of these are ultimately shaming rituals. So, for example, if you you had an inner and outer garment in ancient Palestine. So if somebody sued you for your outer garment and you give them your inner garment, you're basically naked. And so you're going to rock around town naked. I mean, Isaiah did that, and that was a humiliation ritual for Israel. So it's sort of like you're one-upping them, right? The rich man has power over you. The soldier who compels you to go 1 mile has power over you. And obviously, if you had power parity, they wouldn't be able to do that to you. So then what do you do in that situation when you don't have power parity? You sort of unmask them by showing to the world their true nature.
I can't help pausing to comment on Christ's fulfillment of this instruction himself. Do not resist an evil person. Jesus could easily have escaped since he knew what was coming, but he didn't resist the betrayal of Judas. He didn't resist the arrest. He didn't resist during the trial. He didn't resist at any point during the crucifixion. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also, brings to mind the whipping, the scourging, and of course ultimately the crucifixion itself. If anyone, and as you were saying, this taking the shirt and the coat, Jesus was shamed and naked on the cross, so the ultimate humiliation. And then he carried the cross. So if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. He was forced to carry the kind of horizontal piece of the cross, right? He had to take it all the way. This was after his scourging, and yet he carried it. Once again, he could have at any point, of course, escaped, as he did so many times through the Gospels. And then this give to the one who asks you and do not turn away, to me, brings to mind, ask and you will receive, knock and the door will be open to you. In a way, the one who asks, if we are the ones who've crucified Jesus, we are the evil person who's responsible for all this, and yet Jesus will fulfill his own commands and will give to us. I know that's not really on the topic of the stream, but
but it's true. I mean, Christ is the one that we're supposed to imitate. It's Christian.
True. So. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, John 18:36.
Do you want to read this one?
Yeah, I'll read it.
36. Here we are.
Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." Now, the operative word here is fight or would fight. The Greek word here is engenzenato, which initially referred to sporting events like wrestling, but also later included references to warfare. Now, given the context that Christ is talking about here, the idea of two kingdoms in collision, the Roman kingdom and his kingdom, this is not a sporting event. This isn't like wrestling or anything like that. This is clearly, a contest between two kingdoms, which implies a more martial tone. And so if we translate this literally, it means to fight hand to hand. And it's like, well, that's such a literal interpretation that when you say fight or struggle, and we'll get to this also with Ephesians chapter 12, these translations sort of reduce the weight of the impact of what the Greek word is actually telling us. It's not saying that, just don't fight. You have two kids and they're quarreling. You're like, don't fight each other, right? The word fight has this broad meaning from petty squabbling where nobody's really going to get hurt, but maybe they might, to an intent to do real physical harm. And it's just true. The vagary, I think, is important because why would you do that? Why? Because it's too expansive, right? If you're giving a report of a soldier on the battlefield and you describe the conflict that's going on, you're going to use much sharper terms, much more clear terms, which would leave the reader or the listener without excuse as to what's going on. They would know. And yeah, it means to engage in a fight or to carry on a fight. Engens and and we get from that we get the word agony, or rather, agony is a part of that. So it shows you how like serious the struggle is. So there, Christ is saying to Pilate, this is wrapping it all up. My servants don't fight for this kingdom. Now, somebody could say, well, okay, fine, no holy wars, no crusades.
Mm-hmm.
But then what about other things? Well, but then okay, then you have the dual loyalty issue of two kingdoms, which has been no end of trouble for Christians trying to solve, which right now lies out the scope of this argument. All I'm saying is that fight here means to engage in a military struggle, not merely, any sort of disagreement.
I can't read this passage without thinking about two kingdom theology, right? The idea that there's the kingdom of God that Jesus is describing. My kingdom is not of this world; it's a spiritual world. We're not of this world, but we are citizens of heaven. We are subject to God, our ultimate master. Our citizenship is in heaven, etc., etc. And this verse is you could. I feel like two kingdom theology perspective is that this is simply saying that the defense of that kingdom is not something that requires war, but that doesn't necessarily comment on whether or not. So I think you could argue this is an argument against just war, but you could still have a pragmatic war position, right? You could say, I'm not fighting for the kingdom of God, but I am fighting for my nation or the defense of my family.
Well, but then this gets into the problem of you can't serve two masters. And there are two types of two kingdom theologies. There's Luther's two kingdom theology, which sort of has a kind of like bifurcated Christian identity between, as a Christian in this lane, you do that, and as a servant of the state in this lane, you do that. But then you have like the Anabaptist two kingdom theology, which says that the Christian does not exist in one of those two kingdoms. He withdraws himself from one of those two kingdoms. So it also depends on which two kingdom theology you're referring to.
Yeah. So if you're saying you can't serve two masters, if you have a boss, for example, if you've or a master, or however you want to phrase it, if somebody tells you, go and make a coffee for me, go fetch some water, depending on which era you're in, go to the well, grab a pail, fetch me some water, go down to Starbucks and get me a coffee. It's kind of the modern day equivalent. If you go and do that, and somebody was to ask you, are you doing this job for yourself, or for God, or for your earthly master? I think the correct and honest answer is you're doing it for your earthly master, but it's not in conflict. There's no, it's not against God's interests for you to do that. And in fact, you can extend it to some of the New Testament teaching about being under an earthly master. And Paul says that you should work hard as though you were working for God. You should be such a good employee that even when your boss isn't watching, you're still working hard.
We need to be clear.
If you're fighting for your country and it's not in conflict with God, so if let's suppose that we accept Jesus is not asking us to fight a holy war, but he's not actually forbidding violence under any circumstances, then I wouldn't say it's necessarily having two masters to go to war for your earthly nation. Do you see what I'm saying?
Well, right, but we need to make a distinction between two kinds of service, right? When Christ says you can't serve two masters, he says God and mammon. And service in this sense is clearly implying absolute loyalty, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course he's saying that, well, one of these two is going to give.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to make that call. So if you do this, so don't do this because you can't. And I think a similar objection could be raised against the state. Sooner or later, like mammon, the state is going to start making claims on you that are going to be in conflict with your conscience and your obligation.
It's pretty easy to pick out people, as it were, who have made mammon their god. They may be going to church, but their heart is in the 9 to 5. What they really care about in life is making money. And if there's ever a conflict, work comes first. And that's an example of you can't serve two masters. In the same way, you could be in the army and your commanding officer forces you, like insists, gives you a direct command and an order, maybe at the point of death, with the threat of court-martial or worse, to go and do something you know to be unethical. And at that point, as a Christian, you would definitely have to object and say, I have a master who is higher than you, my commanding officer, and higher than the king. So I don't think we can say that a Christian cannot conscript unless we can say that it's a direct, it's directly in opposition to God's commands, rather than just because you will have somebody giving you commands, right?
Right, but not to overplay John 18:36 here, because I still want to get to Ephesians chapter 6. The idea being, though, that there is a tension between these two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and then the kingdom of man, with Pilate representing Caesar. And the way that his followers, as he says it in there, they're not going to fight to free him, which, in the Old Testament, when Lot was kidnapped, Abraham raised a raiding party to liberate him.
This is a pretty good verse against the holy war perspective, I would argue. I think this is a useful verse in that perspective. If your view is that, for example, we represent Christendom and we're going to, say, America, right? We are a Christian nation, and therefore we're going to invade the Middle East to make them all Christians. Or I am the Pope, and I'm going to start commanding. I mean, I don't know if this is actually why the Pope was commanding the, what are they called? The Crusades. Thank you. But if the argument in defense of the Crusades is this was in order to Christianize the world, to fulfill the Great Commission, then you have a hard time squaring that with this verse.
Yeah. Lastly, Ephesians 6, chapter 12.
Am I reading this one?
Sure.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm.
Right. So this is again where the translations can be technically correct, but factually, but actually missing the entire point of the passage. So again, wrestle. That's a watered down term, right? So for the Greek, it's pale, P-A-L-E transliterated, and it literally means the act of engaging in hand-to-hand combat. That's literally what that word means. So to translate that literally, what Paul is saying is we do not engage in hand-to-hand combat. That's the literal translation of what that would be. Now, that's going to hit a lot harder than, say, we wrestle, not against. Now, why that's not translated as maximally literally as possible, I think is pretty clear.
Here we are, Pale. I guess it only appears in this verse. Struggle in the NAS, wrestle in the KJV, wrestling in the INT.
Do you ever use the Blue Letter Bible? They go into a little more detail with the terminology.
Let's see. Oh, the GDPR has destroyed the internet, hasn't it?
So you got to click on the hyperlink that says Ephesians 6:12. No, see,
there?
Yeah, there you go. Yep, click on that. Then click on it again. Scroll down. That's funny. When I do it, it works.
Can I just put in Pale here? How's it spelled?
That's how you spell it, but no, it's
coming up with English words. That's no good.
Struggle. You got to type in struggle.
Oh, yeah.
Or wrestle, rather. Wrestle.
It's going to come up with a bunch of Hebrew. Oh, there we go. Yeah, you're right.
Can you click on it? Wrestle?
Well, wrestle I couldn't click on.
Oh, you can't?
Let's not spend too much time trying to get the software to work.
That's fine. No, but the point being here is Paul is laying out, like, because this is leading into the full armor of God. And this is sort of like the Christians' marching orders. And what Paul is saying is that our war as Christians is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and the rulers of this world. So I think this is a pretty clear case. So contrast that with, like, say, I think it's Judges chapter 3, where God basically says to the Israelites, let's see if I can find it. Yeah, now the verses 1 and 2. Now these are the nations which the Lord left, that he might test Israel by them, that is, all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. This was only so that the generation of Israel might be taught to know war, at least those who had not formerly known it. Yeah, that was the Old Testament, and that was the marching orders for Israel from Judges onward. What Paul is saying is completely opposite of that.
The information I'm getting here makes it look like they're saying to it's a from Homer down, wrestling, a contest between two in which each endeavors to throw the other, and which is decided when the victor is able, and then some Greek words, his prostrate antagonist, i.e. hold him down with his hand upon his neck. And then there's references to Plato and Aristotle and various other writers.
Yeah, now of course wrestling is one of the possible meanings, but remember, we're talking about the armor of God. Now we're talking about equipment that you don't put on to go into the ring to wrestle somebody, but equipment you put on to fight in combat. Sword, shield, helmet, things like that.
Mm-hmm. So we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. So we've got that kind of analysis of, like, you're in the ring trying to defeat flesh and blood. And Paul's saying it's not flesh and blood. It's rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Those are the four people that we are at war with, as it were.
Yes. And I think it's also interesting, again, let's go back to the idea of judging them by their fruits. One, right, there's a lot of reasons why Europe is a secular wasteland. But one of the reasons was the way that the churches discredited themselves and all of the combatant powers by supporting the war so much. Right? One of the things that left Russia vulnerable to revolution in 1917 was the fact that the Orthodox Church had so leaned into this war. And it completely blew up in their face. Now, it also blew up in the faces of other churches throughout Europe, but Russia is the most extreme example.
Yeah, I actually think it's probably worth getting the full context of this passage, because I think it's quite effective for your case, for people to just get the thrust of what's happening here. Paul says, "Be strong in the Lord." So this is to go back to my comment earlier that people might say that this pacifism is a feminine position. It's saying be strong. That's a masculine command. Be strong in the strength of his might. Put on armor. This is the armor of God. But what does that armor look like? It's not armor for wrestling against flesh and blood. So take up the armor of God, the belt of truth. So instead of a fleshly, bloody belt, you've got this spiritual belt that's going to reinforce you of truth. The breastplate of righteousness. So you've got to be anchored in things that are true, anchored in things that are righteous. Your shoes should be the gospel of peace. So again, very thematically appropriate that you're going to be able to move because of your interest in peace rather than in war. Your shield that you're defending yourself with is faith, and then the thing you're putting on your head is your salvation, like your spiritual salvation, right? So these are like military concepts that might be appealing, and here these are all being reinterpreted. Your sword is not a bit of metal that you swing around, but is the Holy Spirit. You know?
Yes. And so this is sort of where the Christian is getting his, quote, marching orders, if you will. How ought he to, as Paul says, run the race and fight the good fight? Well, this is what that is. And the other thing I would say, though, too, to the idea that this is effeminate, what the Christian religion teaches is that, and this is what frightened Felix, the governor, so he sent Paul away, is self-control in the coming judgment. Now, being tossed around by your emotions and making decisions based on that, is that not the most feminine thing you could do? Yeah. Right. We all laugh because we know that it is, but the point is, once you acquire this level of self-control, which again, that was with the thrust of Paul's message to the Gentiles, is that a lot of these conflicts that we find ourselves in go away. Because, obviously, there are bad actors out there in the world, and they will harm people. But oftentimes, we are the author of our own discomfort. And by taking proper action, we can minimize that. Let's call them best practices. And if you have the best... Go ahead.
Yeah. I'd argue that, because we do have some women who listen to this, and I think, although it's not something I'm an expert in, but as a comment on femininity, that we should encourage women who are Christians and in our spheres to be feminine. And there is a version of femininity that has a different form of strength, a different form of self-control. But just as you put it, there's this unsightly, well, you didn't put it this way, you said it was feminine, but like I'd say it's unfitting for a man to be out of control with his emotions, to be both strong and going into violent fits of rage and just destroying stuff. Might be portrayed by the pagans as the most masculine thing, but we know that it's much more masculine to both be able to act with great physical force, but to keep it restrained. And so it's not out of a lack of ability, but it's out of self-control. But likewise, I'd say that there is a very praiseworthy, positive version of femininity where, again, the feelings are under control, the emotions are in check, and there is a radiant beauty of femininity that doesn't take in flights of emotional distress or whatever. So yeah, I just wanted to defend that. Just as much as there is like a parody of masculinity that we often hear, that results in people. You see all these men who are like eschewing masculinity altogether because they've been given like a straw man version of what it means to be a man that they rightfully perceive as a bad thing, and instead of reclaiming good true masculinity, they just reject the entire thing. I don't want women to make the same mistake where they hear a horrible parody of what it is to be feminine and then they reject femininity altogether. Like, actually, the image of God is in male and female, and he has made a version of what it is to be a man that's really amazing, and a version of what it is to be a woman that's really amazing. And it's actually very exciting as a Christian to uncover and discover for yourself how to fully express your God-given gender in its most magnificent way.
But to be fair, you were the one that did bring up a feat as a pejorative first. I'm just saying. You did bring it up.
Fair enough. I did. Yes. All right. Well, I'm not accusing you. I'm as much pointing the finger at myself if I've used. But yes, and during the stream, I've a few times commented that one of the reasons people might not want to embrace pacifism is because it might be seen as feminine. But I don't. To be clear, I'm not saying that it's femininity equals bad. What I'm saying is that as a man, you shouldn't want to be feminine. So the concept of pacifism being feminine would be a thing that would push men away from it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because there's a certain way in which this position has been articulated in the past, and there was a certain way in which men have misunderstood it. I think what I'll say here is this: there's a amongst contemporary Christianity, both Protestant and Catholic, there's this effort to sort of regain a sense of the struggle, because they're like, life is too easy. Men want some goal to strive for, some struggle to engage in. And here's the problem, right? What often that means is channeling that struggle outward. Whereas the real struggle, and this is not just a Christian teaching, this is also a teaching of Eastern Hindu Buddhist thought, as well as the Western tradition of Plato and Aristotle. The real struggle begins and ends inside of you. And when a man, right, Jack Donovan was still is popular amongst many on the right for his idea of mastery, the idea of the man of mastery. But whether it's him or whether it's more scholarly people like Anthony Eslin or Harvey Mansfield, or the podcaster like The Art of Manliness, Brett McKay, what all of them leave out is like, this is an external mastery over other things. But mastery begins and ends with the self. You have to master the self. That's been the common thread of Western thought from the beginning. So one, to say it's a Christian concept alone is not correct, because I guess the pagans were supposed to be more indulgent. I mean, they had self-control issues, of course, but their intellectual traditions were like, at their best, were like, no, we have to work against these tendencies in order to have order. And so the struggle is just is reoriented inward, but then also outward, but not against, I mean, a good example might be the Matrix. We're fighting the agents, not other people.
Yeah, I guess the inner strength, the inner resolve and self-control will inevitably lead to your external reality being changed as well, right? If you're somebody who has inner self-control, for example, then you won't overeat, and so therefore you won't be massively obese. So you can say that there is a consonance between these external features and the internal change, but to only address the external change is like dealing with the symptoms rather than cause of the disease. If
Yes.
if it's a natural thing, so some of this manliness stuff, the art of manliness is like chopping wood with an axe, or I don't know, some athletic achievement, or having a well-trimmed beard, or whatever. Uh, I I'd argue that these things, in many cases, are indeed fairly good indicators that you might use to measure, to like detect the inner self-control and resolve. Because if you're as a man, if you've conquered the internal challenges, then it might, in the right context, if you live in a cold part of the world and some logs need chopping, you're going to be up for going out and doing it, and you'll be challenging yourself physically, and you'll become strong. And so the kind of manly vision of somebody chopping logs is like a reasonable way to say, I see the man chopping logs, he's manly. But what you're really doing is you're trying to discern what's going on inside. So if you take somebody who just is a mess internally, has lost the internal battle, and just train him to chop logs, even though log chopping is not required, and he's a mess, but he can kind of create the superficial appearance of being a useful member of society using his masculinity well, then that's a LARP at that point. You should be transformed internally and then let your world reflect that, rather than trying to find the superficial elements of what you think masculinity is and wear them like a skin suit.
Right. And a lot of these men are wearing it as a skin suit because there's usually one of three notable areas, if not all three, where they lack total self-control at all. Sexually, financially, and alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, when you think of these guys, they flunk all of those in general, right? One or all of them. And it's like, okay, well, you didn't actually acquire mastery. You acquire, and you see,
Yeah.
the other thing too with mastery is all skills follow a symbolic structure of learning. So if you learn one, you could in theory learn others. So the first one you have to learn is self-mastery, because one, that puts you in a position to do things in the world without having a lot of unnecessary blowback, which is what the whole Christian moral tradition does. And then two, you've already learned the process of acquiring skills, acquiring mastery. So now you can then take that. See, you can then take that and apply to all these other areas.
Yeah, I was just thinking that there is this concept of LARP until it becomes real. And I think there probably is something to that. So I think of, for example, people who think, well, I couldn't possibly attend church because I'm not, I'm not a real Christian. And then they try it and they go along and they feel really out of place and they don't belong, but they keep going anyway. And then several years later, because of going to church, they've actually become a Christian and they really fit in, and it feels real. If they had just waited until it didn't feel like a LARP, then that never would have happened. So maybe there is an aspect of you can affect your internal life by starting with the outside world. You can. It's not necessarily wrong to try addressing external things, but you have to recognize that the external features are the easiest ones to fix. And the person who's got true mastery is the one who's mastered his internal world. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, and I bring this up not to say that external struggles or external mastery is to be belittled, but that the idea that something is unmanly, unquote, is generally because of a narrow vision of manhood itself. The idea that it's merely these external operations. Whereas what, and this is what's funny, right? Even amongst the quote unquote pagans, what makes man man and not an animal? Well, according to Aristotle, man has reason, animals don't. And that was the ancient classical perspective that man was man and not merely an animal. Well, okay, well that entails that we can then control and master ourselves. Now, the Christian says yes, that's true. But we also then need to use the power of the Spirit of God to do so. But the point being is that's where it starts. Everybody knows this. Well, everybody used to know this. James, James says in 4:2, you lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain, you fight in war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. And then in verse 3, you ask and do not receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures. So war comes from the desires inside of our heart. Now, Aristotle would have said the same thing. Plato would have said the same thing. Where the difference is how to address that issue.
Now, a comment from chat. Anasta says, I'm sympathetic to the argument that the state is analogous to mammon in this sense, but not that the state per se is always who you serve when going to war.
That's true.
I guess you could be going to war because you want to protect your family, your friends.
Well, I was thinking he might be going to war to serve mammon, because a lot of wars today are the result of a lot of the war.
But that's just going to be another anti-war argument, right? we're not going to agree that a Christian is right to go to war for mammon, but you might say that it's right to sacrifice yourself in war in defense. Like that you could see people seeing that as praiseworthy, that there's people who are coming to attack my town and they're going to kill everybody. We know, we can see, because of what they did to the last town they were at, that so they're going to come and kill my wife and children, and so I'm going to go out and resist them. Is that a different category? Like, if is turn the other cheek, like, or if they want to kill one of your children, give the other child to die as well?
Well, I mean, there would be a different motivation, different than serving the image of the state, but that motivation then has to be weighed on the balance of what does the Bible say as a whole on the subject for a Christian.
If you were, say you owned a home and you were in America and you had a gun and people entered your home in order to kill you and your family, you'd say it was wrong to use the gun to defend your family?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things you could say about this. I think in one sense, it's a somewhat contrived scenario. Like, for example, I mean, how often do people break and enter and kill Amish people? Now, there was that famous incident, like, 10 years ago.
Didn't they force them all to get the jab?
Where there was a school shooting, and then the guy committed suicide afterwards. And I remember the way the Amish handled that at the time. Even like the people in the United States who were not Christians were touched by that example of charity, because I mean, the guy had already killed himself, so he was dead. But they reached out to his wife, and they tried to get beyond this in a way that was far more effective, I think, at influencing other Christians, other non-Christians rather, to take a positive view of that. And so
wait, so you're saying so the school shooter is a great example. It's better than the one I came up with. A school shooter comes in to a school, starts shooting children. are you not going to try and take him out?
Well, in that case, no one did. He took himself out.
No, but if you were there,
Yeah.
I mean, it must be I'm sure there's been many a situation where somebody with a gun did take out the school shooter and saved many lives. So
sure, but isn't that just utilitarianism, or rather
yes,
consequentialism? Sorry,
it's a consequentialist argument, of course, that if you shoot one person to save 20 people, then that's a good thing to have done, versus the deontological, the kind of Kantian murder is wrong always, and you face the consequences.
I mean, but doesn't Christ answer this for us in the garden? Right? He says to Peter, "Put the sword away. If I wanted protection, I could call 12 legions of angels."
Yeah.
So right. A violent group of men is coming to arrest Jesus. Peter comes to his defense, and then Christ reproves him, saying, "No, one, I don't need your help, Peter, because I can have 12 legions of angels if I wanted to. But live by the sword, die by the sword, Peter. You gotta learn that lesson."
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the Bible has some elements of deontology, things that you must never do, regardless of the consequences. So straight up consequentialism goes, I would disagree with. But I think you can also see instances where a situation is used as a justification and is endorsed to break commands. Not all commands. That's what I'm saying, is that I think I would probably take somewhat of a middle position here, that there's some things that you should never do regardless. And there is other things that are commands of what you should do, but there may be situations in which there is a higher, more important command that takes precedence. Like if two things are in conflict.
Well, I mean, I guess what I'll just say is this: is there's basically, as Christians, we all believe that Christ did all of this, died, rose again, and he won, the Roman Empire lost. And of course, that's the centerpiece of history. So it to me, it seems to bespeak a lack of faith, because if Christ achieved the most important work in history doing this, how much? See, because what it is an implicit denial of the power therein, right? Why did Christ achieve the victory? How did the church outlast the Roman Empire? How did, because of the power of God? And the question is, you either quench the spirit or you don't. I think this is really kind of a matter of quenching the spirit, because if you believe that God can do these things, then being aligned to him in this way, I mean, you could even find some Catholics saying this, like St. Francis of Assisi would say this. He would say, what keeps the wars going, right? The conflicts that you guys are complaining about, intra-Catholic squabbles or Catholic versus Muslim, is you guys keep fighting over all these things, right? You have these plausible justifications. Well, he hit first, or he hit first, and it just keeps spiraling out. And so the question is, it's a process. That the process can't be reduced to a single instance. And so do you want to short circuit the process, which is exactly what Christ did, or do you want to keep feeding the process? That's really the choice ultimately.
So how about, as an example, the command that you should tell the truth? Well, I suppose the command is actually not to bear false witness against a neighbor, but the general principle of like, you should be truthful, against Rahab, who hides the Israelite spies who've come into Jericho. And then she's actually commended in Hebrews 11 in the halls of faith, and she's described as having hidden the spies out of faith, and that chapter is unequivocally describing people doing the good and godly thing.
Well, in the case of the law of Moses and Rahab, I mean, right, the do not bear false witness would be against a brother, not somebody you're at war with, right? That's the context of the Old Testament. So you could argue that deception in war, like David deceived the king of one of the kings of the Philistines by pretending to be mad. But that's a totally different category from also where we are now in the age of the church, because going back to Matthew 5, on the one hand, we're held to higher standards about things like hate and lust, and most people would agree to that. But then they want to hold us to lower standards in other areas. Well, you can't really do that. It's holding the standards that Christ holds us to are above those that Moses held people to.
So how about in fact, maybe we could go to it in Mark 2. Give me a second. Mark 2. So this is Jesus is being challenged, and they're eating heads of grain. The Pharisees say it's not lawful to harvest on the Sabbath. And Jesus brings up this example. Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which was consecrated. It's not lawful for them to eat that. They're not priests. So David and his companions eat this consecrated bread, and Jesus here is defending them as having done something that was correct, even though it was unlawful. So is this an example of clearly, according to the law of Moses at that time, David and his companions were breaking the commands, and yet it was acceptable due to the situation that they were in?
Well, again, this is an Old Testament example, just like with Rahab. I mean, certain even divorce and remarriage, we know from the New Testament, right? Christ says that was a concession given to Israel because of their hard hearts. So I think a lot of these all just get chalked up under the hard-hearted category of concession.
But Jesus was reinterpreting divorce in his time and saying that you shouldn't do it, even though it was allowed in the law of Moses. In this case, he's picking from the grain fields, and he seems to be being more lenient than the Old Testament.
Well, you see, but what's the whole context here? Go back to go to 27. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, right? He's not really talking. Yes, David and this consecrated bread is an example, but the punchline is that you're yoking men to serving some sort of tradition about the Sabbath, which is impinging upon the true intention of what the Sabbath was meant to be. Going back to binding men, with heavy loads and not lifting your little finger to help them.
Right. Yeah.
So that's the message here. So what Christ is saying is, look, one, we're picking heads of grain on the field, but also, but you, the Pharisees, right? You're the ones who ultimately end up violating the Sabbath. And they ultimately end up violating all their own rules by creating loopholes, which is why he talks about, if you lose your sheep on the Sabbath, are you not going to go look for them?
Right. So they weren't even following it themselves.
Yes.
They were really just looking for a reason to accuse Jesus. I think it's pretty clear. They didn't actually care about following the Sabbath. They just didn't like Jesus. And they were like, aha, we've caught them out by this bylaw. And Jesus is saying that, look, well, for a start, you're not even keeping the spirit of this law yourself. For a second, the spirit of the law, like by the spirit of the law, we're not breaking it ourselves. This is the, well, maybe he would argue that going out and getting a sheep out of the well is also justified. So that is keeping the spirit of the law, because it's not for the Sabbath itself, but the Sabbath is for man. Interesting. Anyway, yes, probably the priests were. Would you say they were right to go and get their own sheep? Was Jesus condemning them there, or was he actually saying that, look, you understand that the Sabbath is for man?
I think what he's getting at here is that, one, they don't even keep their own interpretation of the Sabbath.
Right.
And that, two, he says, is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? Obviously, it's lawful to do good. And so he's saying that your hard hearts have narrowly interpreted this to the detriment of other people.
Okay, there's one other sort of topic that I think we have to address in the stream, which is if it's, well, yeah, I guess I was going to say what is the reading of the wars that God does directly command, but I guess you've kind of addressed that already, so maybe we don't need to talk about it. You're saying that this is a pacifistic position specifically because we're in a different age to the Old Testament,
right?
So it's not a murder is wrong at all times kind of argument. You're saying when God commanded the Israelites to go to war, at that time it was right for them to go to war.
Yes.
But we're now in a time when you're saying, based on those prophets and then based on Jesus's words, that we should be non-resistant people. Yeah.
There's a new, just like in the Old Testament, Israel was commanded to circumcise their sons. That's no longer required in the New Testament.
So I think we can agree that there are different expectations and commands for different people and peoples, sometimes in a very broad way across lots of people, sometimes because God's given you, a specific person, a specific job to do. And that command applies to nobody else except you. You have to go and do that thing.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, it's different now. That's the point. So,
and what about the Christians in positions of authority? Because Romans 11, am I right, talks about bearing the sword for God.
13. You're talking about 13.
13. Yes, you're right. Romans 13. Just in fact, I'll find it. So, would you say that you're specifically talking about Christians, being conscripted to war, but not? So, if you were working as part of the justice system, say, punishing evil, because I think it's hard to say that you can have authority, like, those in authority, the very structure of having authority is being commended in Romans 13. It's saying this is instituted by God, and authority requires force. To take a very libertarian line, you've got to have force in order to be in charge. So how then should a Christian act if they are the governing authority?
This kind of gets back to the 4th century. Again, this is outside of our discussion to go into full depth, but this goes back to the question of the 4th century. What do you? There's an implicit, I would argue it's kind of weaselly, an implicit argument that, well, we have to use it now. It's like, well, Well, who gave it to you? Who gave it to you? Because I think we can make a pretty good case from Dostoevsky's The Great Inquisitor that it wasn't God that gave it to you. And I quote, and accepting the kingdom of the world in Caesar's purple, one would have founded a universal kingdom and secured to mankind eternal peace. And who can rule mankind better than those who have possessed themselves of men's conscience and hold in their hand man's daily bread? Having accepted Caesar's glaive and purple, we had, of course, but to deny thee, to henceforth follow him alone. And Dostoevsky gets pretty close, I think, to the truth on that one. Because there's an assumption that we should, but the should is never articulated. It's an unstated premise. Where does the should come from?
Well, in a way, Romans 13 is quite in line with the sentiment of this passage is very much in line with what you've been saying, right? It's don't resist.
Well, but not only that,
you might want to be in a rebellious group of Christians, not refusing to pay taxes on the basis that the Romans are ungodly and they're using that money for bad things, and we may feel similarly that I don't know, they're using our money for gender reassignment surgeries and abortion and all kinds of ungodly things. So we're going to refuse to pay it, and in fact we're going to try and resist.
Yep.
The kind of thrust of Romans 13 is actually that isn't, and I think the kind of cumulative case that you've been making says actually Christians are not warring on an earthly plane. Their war is against the spiritual things. So if you as a Christian are going to go to battle, you're going to do so with the sword of the Spirit and the helmet of salvation and all those things that we saw before.
Well, I think also too, this more what we might call carnal Christianity, where the struggle is diminished and reduced to, well, no Christian is going to say we don't battle spiritually. Their actions do not align with their words. They spend far more time in things like political battles, battles for their career and business, and not on spiritual battle. So we have one as an opportunity cost. Okay, well, when do you actually train for spiritual battle? And it turns out that doesn't really ever seem to happen. And then two, the church is in complete rout everywhere around the world. Well, at least in the Western world. I mean, I'm suspicious of the success stories in other parts of the world, but that's a different category altogether. But the Western world is en route everywhere. Why? Well, because Satan's been attacking and we haven't been defending. Because we've redirected our priorities to everything but where we were supposed to be.
I like to think that here on Lambda Bible Studies, whenever I'm streaming, we're training. Everyone listening to this, you're in the gym, you're doing your parries, your thrusts, you've got your sword of the Spirit out. You're going to be part of the resistance, the spiritual resistance to the attacks of the devil. You know, maybe we are the few. I just feel like we need a rallying, like a Shakespearean Henry V kind of speech to rally the troops, but on a spiritual front. Maybe I'll write that and do it at the weekend retreat. But there is something in me that I think I kind of feel is a right sense of like, I want to be bold and strong for good godliness, and there's a kind of a will to fight but for righteous things. I remember I had a friend at uni who was from an Orthodox Christian background, and he used to do MMA, and he always used to come to me and ask what I thought. He was very concerned because as a Christian, he felt like maybe he was doing something wrong being part of this violent sport. But then he said to me that, well, when I'm fighting, I'm imagining protecting, you know, my mother. Does that make it okay? I didn't really know what to answer to him at the time, and I'm still pretty well. Yeah, I'm not sure that MMA is a wise stewardship of our body. You know, those people get pretty destroyed physically in a way that is you know, difficult to defend. But the reason I brought this up in the first place is that there is something that feels correct about that instinct that men have, that they're willing to put their life on the line to oppose genuine evil. And so I guess what I'm saying is that I guess I have an instinctive resistance to total blanket pacifism, partly because it seems to go against what I consider to be a good godly instinct. But then I do have to recognize that Jesus himself, the perfect man, never fought you know, in a violent way against evil. And I can't, you know, if I'm saying that I would be deficient as a man for never having fought physically against evil, then I then have to also be saying that Jesus was deficient as a man. So I can't be saying that.
Well, and then you also need to ask yourself, why do you have certain conceptions of masculinity in the first
Yes,
place?
is this yes? If my argument is just I intuitively feel this is right, that's not a very good argument.
I don't think that would pass muster for a lot of people.
No, it doesn't. No, although yes, I'm trying to be. This here's a feminine statement for you. I'm trying to be more in touch with my intuition. I think it's an underrated. I think it's a post enlightenment curse that we consider rationality to be the beginning and end of thought, and
Well,
I think rationality needs to be a piece in the jigsaw puzzle of our thinking.
well, to your friend's point, your Eastern Orthodox friend who did MMA, this is interesting, right? Because this is a theme that you see a little bit more before the Radical Reformation in the Eastern Church than in the Western Church. In his Byzantium at War, John Halden writes, many men who had completed their service in the army, as well as many who were trying to avoid conscription or who had deserted, entered a monastery. Most of the evidence concerns senior officers, but there is nonetheless some information on ordinary soldiers opting for this mode of retirement, in particular those who had no family cares. Official regulations forbidding soldiers to join a monastery were repeated from the late Roman legislation. Adopting the monastic life catered both for the spiritual well-being of the individuals concerned, as well as providing a degree of economic security. It offered at the same time a way through which the soldiers could atone for their sins he had committed in killing the enemies of the empire. I thought, huh. So a lot of Byzantine soldiers had second thoughts about what they were doing. So this is interesting, right? Because what it shows us is that there is this deep feeling of, at best, inconsistency and at worst hypocrisy between a Christian who's a soldier in this situation. And it leads to, at least in the case here that John Halden mentioned, this sense of, well, I'm just going to leave the world now. I got to sort this out. I don't know what else to do.
I imagine that being in a war exposes you to the temptation and opportunity for some very dark sinning that
Oh, yes.
I imagine there's lots of people who, because they went to war, are left with great moral reckoning and soul searching in the aftermath, that they can't reconcile what they've done. but that's not necessary in that I can also foresee somebody going to war and what do what's that film? Hacksaw Ridge. Have you seen Hacksaw Ridge?
Yes.
Yeah, because the character in that is pacifist, right? In fact, does he
Yes.
have a like Mennonite background?
I think he's a Seventh-day Adventist.
Right. And he goes to war because he feels he's kind of an interesting case of somebody who both feels the tug of not wanting to be a coward, not wanting to skip out on opposing evil, but also not being prepared to do violence. And his solution to this is to sort of be on the battlefield as a medic, like carrying people around on stretchers and things.
Yeah.
So, what would you think of that path? Like, should if you are taking part in what the military is up to, are you participating in the killing that's happening? Are you sort of enabling it? And likewise, if I refuse to do weapons technology. Like I refuse to be an engineer who's building a missile, but I will build really good armor on a tank. And then you go, okay, but the tank is now going to be able to shoot people.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, at the time, okay, Desmond Ross he's the guy. He was
the real guy, yeah.
highly unusual because the army would for like the classic peace churches, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Quakers, they were given non-combat missions. Like some of it included like forestry work. They're still working now. That itself was divisive even within those communities, but it wasn't anything related to the military, right? It was like, oh, you're doing forestry work, or you're doing, something like that. Now, however you want to parse that decision, I don't think it'd be wise to actually join the army as such.
Okay.
I understand sort of what Desmond Ross was trying to get at, but I don't. His heart was in the right place. I just don't think it was very.
You don't think he quite solved it? What if, to go one stage back further? Then, all right. What if your country is at war, and you are working in a factory producing rations that are going to be sent to the front line?
Well, right. This again is a separate discussion altogether, but really what we're really getting at is going back to the two kingdoms. There's two versions, Luther's and the Anabaptists. How does the Christian relate to the state and the broader world as a whole? Reinhold Niebuhr covers that in his Christ and Culture series. I'm going to argue for, maximal distance. I think I would object to the term "my country" because as a Christian, going back to these early authors, they wrote also about the government and about oaths and about all of these other things, and they didn't really see the Roman Empire as their kingdom. Now, in the 4th and 5th centuries, that changed for a variety of reasons. But again, I think all of this is just an imposition on a reading of the text and the original Christian position as a result of downstream of certain contingent events in Roman history.
There's in America, isn't there quite a culture of pledging allegiance to the flag, this kind of language?
Yes, especially amongst Christians. So
I'm very uncomfortable with seeing flags in churches. I've actually very rarely seen it, but as I understand it in America, it's not uncommon. Is that right?
No, it's not. It's not uncommon. And
that seems to me, that seems wrong. I don't know. If you're in favor of putting a national flag inside a church, then put your comments down below. But it seems pretty indefensible to me. I mean, maybe an example that might make people. So I can imagine that there's patriotic Americans in the audience who don't see the problem. But something that happened around me in the last couple of years is churches flying the Ukrainian flag up above the spire of their church. Um, it just seems like an inversion of the proper hierarchy to put something else as your. I mean, it's like we were talking about the two masters.
Two masters, yeah.
You can't serve two masters. What's your highest? What's your religion? What's the thing that you care about the most? No matter how strongly you felt about Ukraine, you shouldn't have been worshipping it. And
Yeah.
likewise, if even if you try to think of something that might be more that might be more of a moral quandary for people in the audience here. I don't know. I guess a lot of people watching maybe were anti-EU, so I don't know. Maybe if if you were celebrating Brexit in your pulpit of your church, that seems unseemly to me. Like the church should be about the worship of God as your purpose, the raison d'être of the institution, of the building, of the people there, and not other causes, not being divisive. Yes. Sorry, that's a bit of an aside.
Well, I mean, but isn't that the problem in general? The church is just less relevant than ever because it keeps getting bogged down in these worldly struggles rather than where it really should be directing its energies.
Yeah. I mean, it's the most relevant thing that's possible if it's done correctly. If it's about the spiritual battle, which is the true problem and the true origin of all of the secondary problems that we worry about, when the church is calling people to repentance, it's the only force that's addressing the deep issues that need to be addressed. So yes, I mean, there's a lot of the taking up arms for the struggle kind of resistance. I'm thinking of all the various revolutions that have happened in the last couple of 100 years that are quite utopian, but in a very secular way. And I think that what they are fundamentally missing is what Jesus was talking about there, about like you don't take up arms to fight with people, or as Paul was saying, we're not fighting flesh and blood. The thing that we should go to war with is unrighteousness, is ungodliness. And in that sense, the solution to the problem is never going to be picking up a gun, picking up a missile or a tank or a plane or whatever, a big nuke. Like those things are the tools of the governing authorities, of the armies. I mean, I suppose I should try and figure out what my position is, and I've largely just been interrogating you or asking you questions, I suppose. But I'd find it very difficult to conscript. In that I just don't think there have been convincingly Christian nations ever in history. Like they've all been at best allowing the existing Christian population to think that the government is standing up for Christian principles. And so when you fight for your country, then you are going out to do violence and kill for the benefit of something other than a Christian nation. So I think I am basically inclined to agree that I struggle to think of a defensible war morally. So if I don't know if I go so far as resisting using a gun to kill a school shooter. I think that case would still be the right thing for a Christian to do. So I think we probably have a difference in the individual. Like I wouldn't push the pacifism quite as far as you, but in terms of war, like I think I do take a pretty similar position, an anti-war. Like it's not something that Christians should sign up for.
Well, let me give you this analogy, okay? Let's say you have a friend who always shows up to your house muddy, and you're like, "Why are your clothes and shoes muddy?" And he's always asking you, "Well, how can I, make them, less sticky? How can I get the mud not to stick to me?" Then you ask him a question. Then you ask him, "What's the path that you take to come to my house?" And he walks where all the mud is, and you hit your forehead, and you're like, you don't need to ask me about like these microfibers that mud won't stick to. Just don't walk in the mud. right. And so a lot of these like scenarios where it's life or death kind of strike me as that. Why are you walking in the mud? Why don't you find some other way to walk? That doesn't mean mud won't ever come on you, but like you're literally taking their path that maximizes you getting muddy, and then you complain that you're muddy. Well, okay, I mean, you took the path that guaranteed you'd get muddy. So what I'm saying is these people who end up in these situations, not always. I mean, again, the Amish school shooting was an example where they did their best to avoid it. But if you're walking in that way and it happens, well, okay, you're sort of responsible in part because you put yourself in that situation, right? Prevention is better than treatment in medicine. Though from the point of commercial medicine, treatment's better because you can pay for it. But we have this treatment rather than prevention mentality as Christians. And that's why things keep going wrong. Stop treating the problem, prevent the problem. It never seems, in my entire life as a Christian, I just never see that.
I think as a leader, if I was both a Christian and a king, let's say, I don't know how this has happened, but could be. It's not unlikely to happen to me, but hypothetically, and I'm in charge of this nation, and I have all these people in my power to tell them do this, do that. I would use force to uphold justice. I would command. So I mean, not just force, lethal force. Like, my opinion is that there are crimes that deserve capital punishment, for example. And so as a consequence, if the nation I was ruling over were all Christians, somebody's going to have to be the executioner as well. So that means somebody being instructed by their authority to kill somebody else.
Well, this might seem odd that I'm going to quote William Tecumseh Sherman, but this is I think he has the correct attitude towards political authority. He once said, "I will not accept if nominated and will not serve if elected." That was the 1884 election. So,
I mean, I never said I would become prime minister. I'm not messing around with that democracy nonsense.
No, but the point that Sherman is saying, he doesn't want to be in that position at all.
But I don't know if I agree with him. I think if you are in a position of power and you are a good person, then you can and should seek to use that power for good. Now, you might be incapable, too young, too immature, but we should seek to become strong men who can lead well. And that's actually a reflection of a like doesn't it say I think it's Paul again, anyone who seeks to become an overseer seeks a good thing. Now that's power within a church, but it's still an example of power. God is king. Jesus is king. You know, the concept of kingship is not universally derided in the Bible. But maybe those are all.
But then the question is, goes back to Jesus. How did he show us he was king?
Well, I know you're thinking of his death, but we also see him in judgment. We see him in Revelation seeming quite terrifying. You know, out of his mouth comes a double-edged sword, piercing to the very division of soul and spirit.
Now you're
mixing okay, I'm pulling together texts.
Wow. Okay. Okay.
Jesus says maybe that's not a good practice. I'm kind of assuming. I hope people listening. I'm hoping that you are picking up the full context of the different bits of scripture that I mention. That requires you to have read and thought about them. Don't just like take what I'm saying now as if it was lines of scripture. That you know what I'm saying? Like I'm trying to do a sweep of a biblical context.
I think the real issue is, Luke, you're in a spot of trouble there.
Well, Jesus said, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword, and I will turn, sons against fathers and mothers against their daughters. This is not, on the face of it, a pacifistic rule. This is a revolutionary.
Well, remember what is the sword, right? Hebrews 4:12, the word of God, that's the sword, is a living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is the discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
That's the sword. That's the division, and that's consistent with Ephesians chapter 6.
Yeah.
Because what are you cutting? What are you cutting to? You're cutting past the physical, which is easy to get tripped up on, to get to what's behind it, what's behind the motivating principle.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're getting at.
Yeah. And I mean, Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. And then he says, I've not come to bring peace. So that's an example of like, you can pick one verse if you want to make one point. You could pick the other verse if you want to make the other point. We believe that all scripture is God-breathed, so we have to go deeper and understand each verse fully in its own context. Instead of picking and choosing, we need to make a holistic whole that all makes sense. So just as a point of hermeneutics, like, you shouldn't just grab texts out of the air and you like throw them to try to make them stick and fit your position. What you should do is very diligently and carefully go through passage by passage, think deeply and understand it, and like fit them into a complete worldview. So yes, I'm very much not interested in debating. I don't think it's a helpful mode, right? The concept of somebody to watch a debate as a way to getting to truth is a way to come out with very shallow and ill-conceived conclusions. Like, if you want to know about the Bible, you should devote yourself to reading and meditating upon it regularly and deeply for years, and that sitting under good preaching and so on and so on. So yeah, the correct way to interpret Jesus' teaching is usually not straightforward. I think yeah, I would agree that when Jesus says, I've come to bring a sword, he's not meaning a literal sword. So yes, I I withdraw that as a as a scripture against pacifism, I guess. I'm a little uncertain about, I mean, your point about trying as a Christian not wanting power feels feels like a cop out to me. Do you have a scriptural defense for Christians not becoming powerful
Well,
or wealthy or
well, we
anything
need to
else?
also defend what we mean by powerful or power. I mean, David says some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but we trust in God. I mean, a lot of these objections are starting to sound like, oh, where's your chariots? Where's your fortresses? Where's all these powerful things? And it's like,
well,
that's not.
I totally, just to be clear, I totally agree with David's sentiment there, that our fundamental war, like all these verses that we've looked at today, are all lining up to the same conclusion, which is the thing that matters is the spiritual warfare, and the most important thing that happens in your life is not going to be becoming powerful, rich. It's not going to be somebody else having political power, some war that gets fought. The thing that matters is going to be the participation that you have in the spiritual battle.
Okay, Luke 22:25, and he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority of them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as one who serves.
I mean, that sounds to me like the behavior within churches should be that the people who are rich and wealthy and influential in the outside world should behave humbly in the church. For example, Jesus, who was the most powerful outside of the, Jesus is in a social context, for example. They've just arrived at a house, and outside of the house, Jesus is the Lord of all creation. But in his behavior amongst his disciples, he washes their feet, the very behavior of a servant. So in so doing, Jesus is demonstrating servant leadership, but he's not saying that his power was bad. He was saying that wielding power for his own benefit was bad. I kind of feel the same way about money. So a person who earns or controls a lot of money as a Christian should not use it for his own advantage, should not be using it selfishly. But also, I don't think that he ought to necessarily give all of his money away. He should give some of it away, and he should use some of it for his own needs, his own food and shelter and so on. But then there's potentially quite a large amount of money left in the middle that he's not given away and he's not using for himself, that he stewards and allocates responsibly and is in control of. And I've heard it many times in pulpits that it's a division into two. Your money is either spent on yourself in a selfish way, I guess buying luxury goods and whatever, or it's spent on others, so that the more you give away, the more godly you are. I actually think that that's a cop-out when you might be abdicating the responsibility. You could use the resources for the benefit of others, but under your direct control. So I really think that this concept of this criticism that is leveled against lording it over people in the church, which definitely is in there in scripture, I don't think that's a criticism of having high status, of having power and influence. It's a criticism of the arrogant, puffed up, self-aggrandizing wielding of that power.
I'll just say I think we're kind of pretty far afield from the topic of our discussion.
Oh yes, that's true. Fair. And we're over 2 hours, so we should probably bring it to an end. Was there anything else that you wanted to say on topic?
No, I think I've still got everything I want to say.
Good. I think the relevance of the question of being in control is that I still think if you're in power, it's right to use force for the purposes of keeping order and control and justice. I'm not sure about if if I was in control, would I have an army? Would I use it for the purpose of war? Probably my feeling is not. And I'm aware the kind of kickback against that is that, well, then somebody else will simply come in with their army and destroy you, and then all of your goodness is as nothing. And I kind of think that's probably is that is inevitable and correct. And that is kind of the nationwide interpretation of Jesus saying, if somebody comes to take your cloak, give them your shirt also, or whichever way around it is. That there is a genuine Christian principle of like, I trust in God to give me my daily bread. I don't trust in my power, my intelligence, etc., my armies. So I think I can, if I'm a leader and I'm not going to have an army, that makes me feel better about saying I'm also not going to conscript, because that was a little bit of a mental I was having a bit of kind of cognitive dissonance over that one. But it's a very interesting and complex topic, and I'm keen to hear other people's thoughts. So put your comments down below. I'll just read a couple of comments before I leave. Jared says, I think defending yourself in the community is fine. So a war that someone else brings to you should be fought. So that's kind of it's right to have self-defense from Jared. And GM. Depends if by power you mean the solution is to try seizing control of the trillionaire's liberal technocracy machine as it's collapsing. And somehow SpongeBob case here, I can't read it. Make it based. So he's I think saying that
you can't do that.
You can't do that. Okay, yeah, fine. I mean, to be clear, I think it's right for a Christian to obtain power by certain means, mostly by being righteous. I mean, there's all kinds of proverbs about, if you're good at what you do, you'll stand before kings, or if you're diligent and hardworking, then you'll become rich. These are general truths, and I think there's nothing wrong with becoming somebody who's capable of generating wealth, generating, commanding people. It's just the way that you then use those capacities once you have them. I mean, there's of course the parable Jesus tells about the guy who's building barns. He's like, build a barn, build a bigger barn. And then he dies. You have to go and read the full parable, but there's that chilling line that God says, "You fool, this very night your life will be." I've forgotten the exact line. It will commanded from you or something. You fool. I'm going to look it up because it's I can't face having misquoted it. And then we will go. This very night your life will be required of you. Then who will own what you have accumulated? So yes, another restatement of this idea that the thing that matters in your life is not how much power or resources that you have. So yeah, let's leave on a point of agreement. Many people have been misled into very foolish uses of violence, and the Bible speaks, I think, pretty clearly against such things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. I have a funny feeling if I rewatch this stream in a year, then I will feel even more strongly in agreement with the points that you're making. So
is that the difference between you, Luke, and I? 1 year.
we should put it in the calendar. The 2nd of February 2025. We'll reconvene and see where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
So once again, everybody go and check out Todd's other stuff. I've put loads of links in the description box. And the other thing in the description box is the weekend retreat, which is going to be awesome. We're in Norfolk this year. I had an amazing idea the other day about the topic that I think I will be speaking on. I'm excited about it. That's going to be really awesome. And it's always just lovely to see everybody. We have a great community. And if you've only ever watched the channel, I feel like you're missing out on secretly the best bit of what's going on with Lambda Bible Studies, which is obviously I feel sorry for people who live abroad because it's much harder for them to make it to the UK. But if you can, take advantage of the fact that you can make it to the weekend retreat. You won't regret it. Whether or not you're a Christian, there's loads of people who've come on it who have not been Christians but have been really blessed by it. I mean, somebody told me last time that on the basis of the first retreat, they ended up getting baptized in the following year, which is just it's such a privilege for God to use the stuff that's going on here in that way. It's really amazing, really exciting, really special. So you go and book. There is a charge. I can't remember what it is. £270 or something. If money is going to be a problem, then let me know, because I don't, I'm very willing to put my money into funding this thing. Talking of stewarding money well, like, this is something that is so clearly good that I'm very happy to. I can't afford to pay for everybody's place, but if don't what I'm saying is, don't let money be a problem. It would just be amazing to see you. So good. All right. Well, I guess I'll see everyone next week. Thanks.